Hey everybody, today we're actually going to be doing something that we've never done here on this channel. We are going to be analyzing a game played between two top chess engines because the strongest engine in the world has just demolished a 3200 rated chess engine named ChessFighter in a very important theoretical battle in the French defense. And what really impressed me the most is that this game ends in checkmate in less than 40 moves, which at the top, when you're talking about 3,000 plus rated engines, that just doesn't happen too often. Most games are 100 plus moves. You see a ton of draws, 80-90% of games. It's like, oh, every move is like everything's a draw. They see everything. They're super strong supercomputers. And today, though, we're going to be taking a look at this because it's just happened. The only thing else I got to let you know before we jump into the game, let me set the scene here for just a second. This is like part of TCEC, but they're in between seasons. So for those of you that don't know, this is like the top chess engine tournaments. They always have engines running and battling each other. I'm usually pretty interested in it, and I watch a lot of the games, and this one was particularly impressive. But the only other things you need to know is that it's 30-minute time control, 3-second increment. So not the longest games, but it's definitely a rapid play style, so plenty of time for computers to calculate. And lastly, there was no book. That's like the last important thing you need to know. That means they weren't forced to start from a certain position. Like sometimes you make the computers play 6, 7, 8, 9 moves of theory, and you're like, all right, here's some random position from the King's Indian defense. It's a little bit imbalanced. Go ahead, play from there and just see what happens. No, on this one, it was just engine versus engine. There was no opening book. The engines are just playing whatever they want. And Stockfish decided that it wanted to play pawn to e4, to which ChessFighter decided to play the French defense. So here we go. Let's see what we're going to get. We get pawn to d4. Pawn to d5, knight to c3. This is like a very common way of handling the French, and nowadays, at least at the top, you can almost expect to see the winnoware played in every occasion, but today, we'll be talking about kind of the more classical variation, knight to f6, after which Stockfish played e5, the Steinitz variation. Knight goes back, and the next few moves, pawn to f4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to e3, are played in almost every single game that goes this line. It's very rare to deviate. This all happens almost by force, but now you reach the point where there's a lot of branches that black might want to choose from, and nowadays the most popular reply for black is to play pawn to a6 with some ideas of playing an early pawn to b5 on the queen side. You also might see c takes d4, which is another popular way. Usually this involves black trying to trade a lot of pieces, but there's also this line, bishop to e7, which shows black just developing the piece, and he's just going to get castled. And I gotta tell you, I gotta come honest, because one other reason that I really want to show you this game is I'm particularly interested in this from the black side of things, because I've played this many, many times as black, and I know that there's like a secret move here that white almost never plays. It's been played in less than 3% of human games, but white actually has a move here that could potentially be very dangerous, and I think Stockfish will do a good job of demonstrating exactly why. But when you're normally facing a human, you expect to almost always see either queen to d2 with the idea of getting castled early on, or you can imagine d takes c5, which is another move that white almost always needs to play before castling on the queen side. But in this game, we saw this very rare move, pawn to a3, and it has a very interesting point that white might be able to get full control on the queen side before playing for a checkmating attack, and that's exactly what happens, because now we saw black get castled. D takes c5, this is important to throw in, and we'll see white make all of these exchanges on the queen side, because after bishop takes c5, white recaptures, black takes back, and now pawn to b4. This is the point of pawn to a3. You kick this knight back, you force it to go back, and now black doesn't have as much action on the queen side as you would usually expect, and now bishop to d3, and all of a sudden, black needs to worry about some potential Greek gift opportunities. Whenever you get this position as black, one of the nature of the French is that when there's a pawn here on e5, you're often cramped, and you don't have a knight on f6 like you would in a lot of other openings, so you always have to be worried that bishop takes h7 followed by knight g5, queen h5, these kinds of attacking ideas are going to be coming at you. So black plays a very sensible move, pawn to f6, which is actually the most common move played in human games, and we're down to very few games played in the master database, but f6 certainly looks like a very reasonable try by black, because you're keeping control over this g5 square. So if white just started sacrificing, he might immediately realize, like, uh-oh, I can't actually jump my knight into g5. But also, you've put a lot of pressure on this e5 pawn, and black is now attacking this pawn 3 times, and white isn't castled. And obviously, if white were forced to, like, take this pawn and get rid of this tension or something, this would be huge for black, because you could just take this back, you'd be attacking this knight, you'd be ready to play pawn to e5. Something like this would be absolutely fantastic. So what is white supposed to do? Well, in this game, white just decided to get castled, and black actually did take on e5. And I'm not one to criticize a 3200 rated chess engine, but is this possibly already a mistake? Like, it looks totally reasonable to just go ahead and win this pawn, but now all of a sudden, bishop takes h7, and white is going to go on to ultimately win a pawn here. After the king takes back, we see knight to g5, and this is a fork, but we're also now attacking this e6 pawn, so when the king goes back, white is able to take. And notice that you're not able to play queen to h5, because knight f6 will just simply defend the h7 square. So instead we see knight takes e6, queen to h4, and I will be kind of honest, when I was kind of watching through this and I didn't have an engine on, I was thinking, like, why doesn't black instead try to play a little bit greedier? Why not queen to b6, attack this king, and when the king goes, move your rook somewhere. You know, I don't know where, just put your rook somewhere, put this guy, like, wherever. But the problem is, wherever you put this rook, if you do decide to save it, is you're going to run into moves like knight to d5. b6 is not a very good square for a queen, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, all these knights are just kind of hopping in. So there's no time to be greedy. Black is going to have to give up the exchange, and black decides to play queen to h4. So now we see takes back. But now after queen takes d5, white is up a pawn. Stockfish has just won a pawn. And for a computer, that's a ton. So now it's just like almost a matter of conversion. If you're a computer, bishop to e6, queen has to go back, queen to h5, f5. And white is just going to simply be able to push this pawn very far. Bishop goes back, pawn to f6, trying to break through. Black decides to play pawn to g6 and just keeps it very stable, but now the rook comes in to d1, and the knight is ready to get hopping in and potentially have access to some squares like the e7 square. Black decides to play a6, preventing any future b4 that maybe white would be thinking of playing in combination with knight to d5. White also takes a little bit of time to be careful and plays a little pawn to h3 action. We see the other rook finally get centralized, rook to c8, and now knight to d5. This is what was played, and the knight is just thinking of hopping into the e7 square, which is what happens after knight e6. We see knight to e7, and obviously white is able to calculate pretty well and realizes that after you get this position, you're just going to win a second pawn, and now Stockfish is up 2 entire pawns, which is huge, and white should just be winning in this position. Knight to d4, though, is what black tries, and obviously black is going to be a little bit tricky, too, attacking this c pawn, but also potentially being able to remaneuver the knight into a more aggressive attacking position. So we see pawn to c3. The knight does, in fact, give this check, and after the king moves, we see queen to h4 with some hint that maybe the queen is trying to sneak in, deliver a check, and cause a little bit of trouble. So no worries. White brings the queen back and makes a double attack, attacking the knight, attacking the bishop. So the knight goes to f4. And here white plays a move that I think would be challenging for a human to try to find. But if you've noticed that your queen and rook, you do have this battery going on, and you're trying to win the bishop on f7, you may want to consider this move pawn to g3, which at first looks a little crazy because you're giving up this h-pawn with check, but then you drop back and you realize, okay, if this knight just goes anywhere, you're going to be taking on f7. So instead, black plays bishop to c4, attacking the rook, and now white just decides to take. And something here happened that I don't think I've ever seen. The computer, as black, just simply goes crazy. Now, what you might expect to happen in this position would be something like bishop takes f1. This is not what happened in the game, because now after this, you're going to get some sort of endgame, almost by force. You can imagine something like this happening on the board, where you're going to get a position where you're playing some rook endgame, a pawn down, but the queenside pawns should actually here be enough for white to be able to win this endgame. But that's not what happened. We saw black absolutely lose its mind, and I don't understand what's happening. Maybe some computer nerds can let me know in the comments below, but black plays queen to h2. Like, what? Just giving up the queen. And now Stockfish here will announce that this is just mate in 8, which is kind of what happened. So for whatever reason, ChessFighter gave up and just decided to throw this game away. But I did think that it was very interesting, and this is how the game ended. This is checkmate. I thought this was very interesting because there's this line in the French that not a lot of people know about this pawn to a3 move, but it's super interesting. And if you do want to check it out, you can get this kind of position. You play b4, you put your bishop here, and if black takes this e-pawn, boom, you're in. You take this, you're up a pawn, and potentially you should be able to get some very good positions with white. So I hope you like that, and if you want to see more computer games, let me know, and also please make sure you subscribe. Thank you. Bye.
If you're feeling trapped like a queen, no blunders, only sacrifice and see, well, you may have the blues. Never be a chicken when you lose.